We live in the age of freely and publicly accessible information, a golden age for learning new knowledge and new skills. Both the way we find information and the way we consume it is majorly being enhanced in this digital age.
This also has massive consequences for education. The role of teachers is changing. From being the sole source of knowledge, teachers are becoming learning managers. The tools at their fingertips, centered around data analytics and AI, virtual reality, robotics, and 3D printing, will allow them to optimize the learning curriculum, experience, and performance rather than producing and distributing learning content as their main activity.
Join us to explore this fascinating new world of education and see what the milestones will be to arrive at a utopia of education and subsequently a utopia for our society.
Welcome to the UTX podcast, where we bring you a utopia created by technology, presented by your Techniax. I'm Val.
And I'm Ani, and today we're going to talk about education technology or EdTech. We will look at what technologies are being implemented in the EdTech space and how they are furthering that industry. We will then look at some successful examples as well as the challenges the EdTech sector is facing. Finally, we will cap it off with our signature Utopian day in the life.
Our focus in EdTech is the untouched potential of technology aiding our learning process. If you, however, are interested in how the brain learns, how brain activity is measured, or how the brain works in general, you should definitely make sure to have a look or listen at episode 6 of our beloved podcast about brain-computer interfaces. And honestly, you should do so anyways. But now, let's dive into EdTech.
So, what is EdTech? The term EdTech collects all new hardware and software technologies that help to facilitate learning and improve learning experiences and effectiveness. The effectiveness by which we learn is impacted by our intrinsic motivation and self confidence to learn a particular subject.
There's also the effect of how well we incentivize our learning, because after all, we are creatures driven by pain and pleasure.
Another factor is how well we focus and thus access our brain's resources.
Of course, the teaching style of the professor or whoever is teaching also impacts how well we learn.
Another important factor is how well the learning materials are capable of impacting our senses by, for instance, using well selected representations or mental images or metaphors.
Also, how actively we learn, how actively engage in the learning process and with the learning content by applying the knowledge ourselves to solve problems or build projects.
And another key factor is whether we have opportunities to share and exchange that knowledge with other learners.
Lastly, there is also an aspect of how well the technology, the knowledge fits into our existing perspectives and views of the world, which relates to constructivism in education, because we construct new knowledge ourselves by synthesizing existing knowledge we have with new facts.
So let us take a look at what specific technologies are applied and how they improve learning. One of the first and most obvious one would be e-learning platforms or video tutorials, search engines, and MOOCs or massive open online courses. And through these, learning has become an on-demand matter where users can actively shape their learning journey. They can decide what to learn, when to learn, how to learn, and crucially, at what pace to learn.
Also, if students miss physical classes, they are able to catch up. During COVID, learning has become more digital as a means of social distancing. Collaboration, gamification, and interactive learning are fostered by chat and video functions in those MOOCs.
Another technology implemented is data analytics and artificial intelligence. And applying these to electronic assessments, but also schools in general, allows for much more detailed, constructive, and helpful evaluations of students.
There's four examples we would like to mention when it comes to applying data analytics and artificial intelligence to education. The first one is auto-generated reports that can reveal more than just test scores or number of questions answered, but can compare progress over time or identify the right learning paths based on historical data.
Another example would be recommender systems that allow for a personalized learning experience based on learning and performance history, pace of learning, as well as personal interests.
Personal interests and knowing these also helps with our third example, which is choosing the career path which matches the student's preferences best. By comparing historical data on personality characteristics, learning preferences, as well as career choices and career satisfaction with those that are already much further in their journey.
And lastly, we have the personalization of not just learning, but knowledge quests in general. And this can be achieved by tutors and mentorship platforms, marketplaces, where in general, dedicated experts can help students with any particular subject.
Onto another technology, virtual reality and augmented reality hold the promise of interactive learning. Simulating virtual environments allows students to immerse themselves in the experience and improves the chances of the learnings actually sticking with the students, making the learning much more memorable.
So specifically, this would be, for instance, in a simulation, the analytic and decision-making skills are improved by allowing users to freely explore options and experience their own consequences.
One of the companies that hosts the most notoriously demanding interview processes also now relies on simulation in order to select their candidates, in order to test their learning abilities. We talk about McKinsey.
Now, together with psychologists and game design experts, Imbellus, which is being acquired by the online game platform Roblox, Imbellus has developed a digital assessment called Problem Solving Game for McKinsey. And in here, users attempt to construct a stable virtual ecosystem by assembling a set of species based on their characteristics and their impact on that ecosystem.
On to robotics. With increasing responsibility for teachers and decreased teacher to student ratios, educational robotics are coming to help.
By processing and outputting language and animating children, robots are here to become the teacher's best friend in the classroom.
Robotics in general hold the promise of fostering children's creativity and educating children to think like engineers by representing modular mechanical or electric properties.
And as humanoids, robots show human characteristics like displaying emotions or sharing similar appearances.
As their capabilities become more advanced, robots are able to recognize and react to certain emotions and adapt their interaction and teaching style to the child's reactions.
And going beyond just the individual child in large school classes, robots can also act as facilitators in small group exercises. They could even serve as the subject of study, especially in STEM education.
Also, in STEM education, 3D printers might become very useful. When it comes to thinking like an engineer, to think creatively and structuredly about assembly problems, 3D printing has a lot to offer.
It obviously allows students to experience, study, and understand the anatomy and construction of objects, and it even allows them to build their own variations.
With the ever increased importance of engineering and manufacturing, 3D printing can be the medium of learning of the future.
Imagine biology students who can now print cells or organs for study, art students who can print their artwork in 3D, or chemistry students that can print molecular structures. And these are just some examples of the many applications that 3D printing can have beyond just STEM, but in general in all types of education.
And lastly, there are also smart pens. Smart pens are writing tools that come with extra technology.
So exo technology would be, say, the ability to record your notes, maybe through voice recognition or specialized writing paper, motion tracking sensors.
These notes can then be synchronized with mobile devices using the provider's app. Access to digitized notes on any mobile device is a huge plus for any learner, and additional algorithmic features like natural language processing might allow these devices to even correct grammar or math mistakes in the future because they understand what has been written.
So we've taken a look at the technologies, but now let's take a look at some actual implementation, some successful, innovative technology-enabled edtech startups to understand how technology can really upgrade our education systems and processes.
You might know and might have already used Kahoot. Kahoot is a quiz facilitation application for learning and interaction purposes. It helps teachers, or in fact anyone that has a classroom to entertain or a seminar room to entertain, to create and manage quizzes and multiple choice questions, receive, analyze, and display answers. A daughter company of Kahoot is Drops. And Drops lets you learn 40 plus languages in a web and mobile application by making use of so-called mnemonic illustrations of the concepts behind the words. So you learn based on media, such as images that represent the concept behind the word. Google has awarded Drops the Best App Award in 2018.
We've now seen quiz systems, but going much further, there are even startups that have already started to integrate robots into the learning process, just like we described before. The Finnish startup Elias Robots has built a humanoid robot with a display for language learning purposes. A humanoid means that it demonstrates human characteristics, in this case, a text to speech feature, which lets the robot learn and output the sound representing a text, and its ability to react to user input. So, this robot is able to learn the skill level of the infant it interacts with and adjust the learning difficulty accordingly. It is also able to sing, dance, and converse with the students in 20 plus languages. Elias Robot solutions are already widely used in Finnish primary schools, so our Scandinavian friends up there are, as usual, quite ahead.
Our second example in robotics is also serving the purpose to learn exactly about that, to learn about robotics. The creation startup STEMI, which initially started from an Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign, has developed a six-legged robot spider with a servo motor. It has also software and connectivity. It can be programmed and commanded by voice, and it serves as a tool to learn robotics, electrical engineering, and programming for kids. The company also offers swift teacher training and support via video. So far, STEMI has found its way inside the classrooms of more than a dozen US states.
Now, as usual with these examples, the more the merrier. This next startup example doesn't involve any spiders, but it is actually a startup that has a massive potential to enhance education. SoftBank Robotics uses the famous Pepper robot series as well as their own robot type called NAO to deliver an educational experience based on visual representation and interaction with humanoid robots. What the robot does is it supports students, for instance, with language learning and inspires and drives them for physical and intellectual exercise, and is even capable of delivering education to children with behavioral diseases such as autism. So, truly a big step forward in enhancing education for everyone.
Coming from robotics to virtual reality, there is the example called Mel Science. Mel Science supports teaching chemistry, biology, and physics by a VR solution coupled with physical materials for lab experiments. These materials are sent regularly to families or teachers based on a subscription model. I guess you can't emphasize enough how much better the knowledge sticks with you when you're able to experience it in 3D in front of your eyes, as opposed to just reading it on paper or having someone tell you about it.
Now we go from virtual reality to another technology that we explored before, which is 3D printing. The Polish startup Skriware, I think we even mentioned this in our 3D printing episode, was initially a Kickstarter project that was intended to provide teachers with an ecosystem that is comprised of a 3D printer and software and example designs, as well as an online learning platform and a modular robot building system. Introducing 3D printing for learning not only builds spatial thinking, but also haptics and imagination. And it also gives a basic understanding of engineering, electronics, and microcontrollers. Scriber also supplies several different filaments for the 3D printer. They all come with a built in camera, touchscreen, and connectivity.
Our last example is related to a smart pen, and one of the leading companies in the smart pen space is LiveScribe. The LiveScribe Symphony 3 is a smart pen which can record notes based on specialized paper with so-called microdots. These microdots allow the pen to localize and track its motion on the paper via sensors. The pen also has a microphone to record notes and internal storage with capacity for more than 1200 A4 pages. Notes can be transcribed in more than 27 languages and synchronized with several cloud providers via the app.
So let's take a look at the current state of the EdTech industry. The EdTech industry is quite huge. It's close enough to the $100 billion fintech industry. So the industry was about $77 billion in 2019, and it's expected to be $90 billion in 2020. For a cumulative, for a CAGR, that's about a range of 12 to 18%. So double-digit growth, which is still quite good. Now, with this growth track, EdTech grows to $285 billion in 2027. That's a prediction, but it looks like it should be possible given the track record as well as the potential impact. And the education and training industry as a whole is expected to grow to $8 trillion by just 2025. So EdTech is definitely one of the areas where there's a lot of untapped potential that we can harness to improve our education and our society.
Arguably, education is the most important lever to improve society. With improved education and sufficient time, you could potentially solve any problem that appears in society. But what are the remaining challenges when it comes to EdTech, when it comes to enhancing education? Well, technology is quite expensive, or rather, you could say education budgets, as opposed to other budgets in the states and in the governments, other government budgets are not high enough. Education is usually a long-term project. You can only see the benefits of a good education system years and even decades after you established it. So sadly, but naturally, political parties and decision makers and politicians are caring much more about other problems in society that are more urgent and are more attributable to their own track record than something like education, which takes a decade to even make a major impact.
Another challenge, and this is of course not that easy for us Utopian Techniacs, is that technology doesn't always automatically guarantee effective learning. In fact, the inappropriate use of technology can even hinder learning efforts. So the previous introductions of new technologies into education didn't turn out to be quite as successful. Things like the radio or television haven't really prevailed in mainstream formal education. This might be related to maybe unrealistic hypes and maybe the promise and failure to achieve the full potential of technology by creating engaging content, by educating teachers about it, and by making strategic use of it where suitable. But we are quite confident that the technologies that we presented to you today, and especially given the examples that we showed, that hopefully these new technologies can really bring about a new era of learning and education.
We also talk a lot about inequality and missing access to technology in this podcast. And this also applies to, and is even worse when it comes to education, when it comes to technology for education. This also includes a lack of major infrastructure like internet access and lack of resources to acquire education hardware and software. This could further widen the gap in the future between the haves and have-nots, or between the developed world and emerging countries. Global inequality might continue to exist or even increase based on major enhancements in EdTech.
Now we come to another challenge that has been featured a lot in the challenge section of our UTX episodes, and this is data privacy and security, and the target conflict between preserving those two while still being able to support technology with the data that makes it so valuable. So, data points collected in education about their children next to their academic progress might include usage or browsing history, medical information, and biometrics. Constant monitoring and supervision might lead children to self censor and limit their creativity. And oftentimes, parents are ill informed, if at all, about how data is collected and used about their children, especially artificial intelligence, analytics, and robotics can unfold. They can really only flourish their personalization and optimization potential once they are fed with personal data. So it's very important to create secure systems to educate stakeholders, especially the teachers and parents, and to design legislation that will marry these objectives so that we can really extract the complete potential that these technologies can provide to education without bringing in any unwanted side effects.
Now, remember that Ani said that there might not be a direct positive correlation between the increased use of technology and the increased effectiveness of learning, with which much remembers me of the fact that there might not be always a positive correlation between increased use of IT and a better business outcome. But this is not necessarily the technology's fault. However, when it comes to children, increased screen time might not be the optimized solution. So parents and in general stakeholders need to find a way to make the use of technology in a sane, in a sustainable way possible, instead of just exposing their children to social media exposing them to limitless and sometimes damaging content.
I
So
would even, oh, sorry, go ahead.
with increased screen time, be it computer, television, and more than ever mobile phones, children's brains rewire and change their structure, potentially causing stress, making it harder for them to focus for a longer time span or staying in charge of their brain's dopamine, letting alone the impact of social media. So if you are able to focus on and follow this podcast, you are already in the top X% of focused people. Congratulations on that.
I would even say that our generation, in fact, everyone to some degree, has already experienced the impacts of it, but increasingly would be today's and tomorrow's children. Media psychology and neuroscience are both not yet capable of fully explaining the impact of technology on our brains, but overexposure to screen time before the age of 7 has shown to cause delay in the development of some skills, even emergence of bad learning habits, and has even, to quote, deprived children of the exploration and play that they need to develop. So we have to, of course, be careful with technology. Like many things that we use, it is a double-edged sword. So it is very much the responsibility of lawmakers, policymakers, as well as tech companies and executives to make sure that all sides that are participated in the use of technology can extract the very best without having any of these unwanted side effects. Another interesting thing is and this is not really related to education, and this is the fact that introduction of technology and the subsequent formation of technological standards could create massive lock-in effects. To quote Professor Langdon Winner, he says that choices tend to become strongly fixed in material equipment, economic investment, and social habit. The original flexibility vanishes for all practical purposes once the initial commitments are made. In that sense, technological innovations are similar to legislative acts or political foundings that establish a framework for public order that will endure over many generations. End quote.
An example of this sort of blind trust in fixed conventions is QWERTY, the QWERTY keyboard layout that we all use, at least in the Western world. It has not really shown to be the most effective keyboard layout, yet it was adopted as the monopolistic solution and created social habits which would be very hard to change in favor of a more efficient layout. If today you wanted to change QWERTY to something else, you would expose a lot of users, including myself, to a big headache.
Interestingly, the QWERTY keyboard layout was chosen because back in the day with typewriters, they separated the letters that would often be used together and wanted to avoid that any of the two feet that would go prints on the paper would get stuck. So it's interesting, as you mentioned, how these old institutions just become so indoctrinated that the cost of changing becomes so high that we stick to these old but illogical tradition of keyboard layouts.
Yeah, and also because you simply had to reteach so many people, you had to give them the new layout. It would just not be worth it, probably.
Yeah, I know. I notice it if I have to type on someone else's computer and they have a different keyboard layout. I keep pressing the wrong keys or having to correct myself more often. So it's definitely a social habit that we can't change. But moving on to another concern regarding the use of algorithmic technology for personalization in education is that personalization can potentially bring along isolation. So I'm sure you've heard of the term echo chamber, or sorry, echo chambers. So social relationships in school, the group learning capabilities, and also the trust and care and respect between teachers and students and other students could suffer from this personalization. So it's definitely useful, especially at a very early stage of education, to have a broader education instead of one that is very personalized from the very first day.
If you ask Elon Musk, he will tell you that formal education today is not really needed because you can learn anything and at any time in the internet. He says that formal education is only a way for you to show that you can do your chores. The concern is that massive open online courses, MOOC, or in fact the internet in general, could displace and is displacing formal education, as well as cultural norms or educational traditions which are experienced and given to the next generation within our education system, and even could disrupt and erode whole education institutions. If, however, this takes place, the change in medium alone shouldn't be made responsible because, after all, traditional institutions also have access to these technologies and benefit from the use of them and are still sought after, at least currently, and trusted for their reputation and their prestige. The trust in the institutions that we build is not necessarily being eroded just by the use of technology alone.
And finally, the last challenge in EdTech is the general state of the VR industry. Now, if you want to learn more about VR, head to our very first episode. But if to shortly summarize it, the VR industry is not as matured. The gear is so expensive, it's often very heavy and not that easy to use. The VR simulations for classrooms could be very expensive to create. And there's simply a lack of skilled 3D designers. So if and when not if, I'm sure it will reach, it's just a matter of time, but when the VR market achieves a mass market adoption by upgrading itself constantly as it is doing, we're sure that this will change and that VR will play an integral role in providing the school experience that children and even teenagers need, especially despite potential measures that we see currently, such as social distancing or who knows.
And how could this experience look like in the future? And
That's a
this
good question.
exactly. So this brings us to the utopian day in the life of the Techniax, in this case powered by EdTech and the future of education. So I bring my kids to school. Our education system now, and I need to mention this up front, teaches focused on the multiple different intelligences. So the school of thought that has achieved the breakthrough is focusing on different intelligences instead of just focusing on the cognitive one. So there's also emotional and social intelligence. There's the haptic and spatial intelligence, as well as depending on preference, you can also learn musical and language-based intelligence. Obviously, different foreign languages are anyways part of our education system. Now, algorithms are in place and they figure out what kids are especially interested in and what they are talented in, but it preserves a comprehensive content approach to their learning journey by not exposing them only to what is their main talent or their main preference, but also to other areas of life. So it does not categorize them too early and stifles their career decisions. Our system now also teaches individual and mass psychology, programming, as well as consciousness and spirituality and media theory. So all of those areas we consider very important for an educated and conscious society.
Exactly. And I want to see how well-rounded our children are being taught in schools. So I get the chance to visit the school during the open house day. And I see that the classwork features a simulation-based learning. And they use VR in the natural sciences. They use robotics and 3D printing in programming, engineering, and design classes. And they use interactive quizzes. And the personalized learning that is based on algorithms, they not only analyze personality, they also analyze learning and performance history of the children using tablets, VR devices, and robots. Both learning content as well as the medium, mode, and schedule of learning are all customized to children's preferences. So I'm very happy to see that the children are engaged and lively and are enjoying education the way it's supposed to be.
My daughter happily shows me the latest student assessment that she got, and student assessments work based on AI and analytics. Instead of providing a one-dimensional numeric rating system, the analysis features personalized reporting of progress in those fields customized to the individual learners. This also relates to career choices, where algorithms based on the children's personality and anonymized historic data of former students and their careers make useful recommendations to the career choices of those children.
Now, even though I've taken some time off for the open school day, I do want to get back to work in the afternoon. And access for children is restricted, but teenagers and adults from the age of 16 have the option to wear brain computer interfaces. The technology has undergone major approval processes in clinical studies, but also in society as a whole, as everybody's or many people are wearing them now and have accepted BCIs. Preliminary applications of it are now possible, such as downloading limited amounts of data to the brain. In my case, I was personally, I'm currently learning C++ for programming robots in my startup. Of course, there's an AI that can do it, but this is sort of a fun project that I'm having on the side with a couple of friends. And my BCI allows me to store this knowledge, not just to my working memory for short-term storage, but it also supports me in the learning process.
So I drive to work, or rather, I get driven to work by my autonomous vehicle, like in every utopian day. And I meet my colleagues to discuss our robots, because remember that my startup is building those robots. We built them to navigate and perform rescue operations in emergency situations in the mountains. These robots should be able to perform mountain rescue mechanisms, but also interact with avalanche or mountain victims and communicate with rescue teams. Our prototype is built and applies reinforcement learning to navigate a virtual simulation of an emergency situation. So the really cool thing about it is that we can monitor and experience the learning process of that robot by an interactive holographic 3D representation of the emergency scene that the robot is navigating. So you see that all those EdTech technologies are not just applying to education itself, but they help any and all of us to learn about new things and to learn also what is happening with robots and AI.
So I took some notes on what I witnessed, and I did it with my new smart pen. And it's a writing tool that has a built-in motion tracking sensor, a camera, as well as natural language processing and computer vision capabilities. So this allows it to not just synchronize my notes to the cloud and thus to all my devices connect to the cloud, including my mobile device, but also to display and correct any grammar and math mistakes. And it's even shown me a performance history and shown that I've been able to improve a lot because I've got back into writing notes with my smart pen, and both my grammar and math have significantly improved.
I take an air taxi, an autonomous one, back to home. If you want to learn more about that, then head over to episode 18 of our podcast on the future of mobility.
It's actually
And
episode 17.
oh, it's 17 because now it's episode 18.
Exactly.
So we made some time back and forth mechanisms, some quantum mechanics coming into play. And I watched the news, which is also about quantum mechanics. So lately, scientists have been working on quantum simulations, meaning they apply newly gained knowledge about subatomic particles, such as quantums, on modeling and simulating previously unknown mechanisms and elements, including the underlying quantum mechanics like gravitational waves, dark matter, and quantum computing. The results are yet to be confirmed, but the consequences on science are expected to be phenomenal, and thus also the consequences on society. What an exciting time to be alive.
Indeed. And with that, we wrap our episode on EdTech. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to let us and YouTube know that you value this podcast. As usual, you can find us on all major streaming platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and even as a blog on Medium.
For every episode, also on this one, we will follow up on what we consider the most exciting, most interesting parts of the episode, and we will feature them as short clips, which you can watch here on YouTube. This has been episode 18 of the Utopian Techniax podcast. Our next episode 19 will be on the future of robotics as well as robotic process automation, which are also called software robotics. In the meantime, stay calm, stay patient, and as always,
stay utopian.
Your Techniax.